The neon buzz of the roadside diner sign flickered against the desert night, casting a dull red glow over the cracked pavement. The place had seen better days, chipped formica counters, faded booths, the scent of old grease clinging to the air. But it was still standing, still open. And for a man like Jack Grizz Calloway, that was enough. He sat in his usual booth, back to the wall, facing the door. Old habits died hard. The coffee in front of him was black, steaming, untouched. The waitress, Rachel, had stopped trying to refill it. She knew how he drank it, slow, deliberate, like a man who was in no rush to finish anything anymore. The diner was quiet, just a handful of locals finishing their meals. Joe, the owner, wiped down the counter while the radio played some old country tune, the kind no one really listens to but never turns off. Then the roar of motorcycles shattered the peace. Rachel flinched, her grip tightening on the coffee pot. Joe looked up from the counter, his expression darkening. Everyone knew what that sound meant. Trouble. The engines cut out one by one. The silence that followed was worse. Hello, Mr. Pictures here, and before we continue with the story, please subscribe to the channel as it would allow me to continue with these stories. Thank you. Now, back to the story. The door swung open hard, hitting the wall with a dull thud. 7 men strode in, leather jackets, steel-toed boots, the kind of swagger that came from years of no one telling them no. They weren't from around here. Their patches read, Reaper's Sons, a name that had been making the rounds lately, running guns, shaking down small businesses, looking for places to take over. Tonight, they'd picked the wrong one. The leader, a lean, snake-eyed bastard named Vance, smirked as he scanned the diner. He wasn't here for the food. Damn, he drawled. This place smells like old grease and broken dreams. His crew laughed, spreading out, claiming space that wasn't theirs. One leaned against the jukebox, another slid into a booth where a couple of teenagers had been eating, forcing them to scatter. Rachel backed away, moving behind the counter. Joe gritted his teeth, but said nothing. He knew better than to pick a fight he couldn't win. But Vance's eyes locked onto Grizz. The old veteran hadn't moved. He sat in his booth, calm, still, his worn army jacket draped over his shoulders. His gaze was steady, unreadable. Vance grinned. "Look at this," he said, elbowing one of his men. Old-timers still in uniform. The laughter from his crew was immediate. One of them, a thick-necked brute with a skull tattoo on his hand, smirked. "Damn, Gramps, you get lost on your way to the nursing home?" Grizz didn't react. Vance slid into the booth across from him, grinning like a man who thought he was in control. "Bet you got some war stories, huh?" he mused. "Sitting here all quiet like you've seen some shit." Grizz lifted his coffee cup, took a slow sip, and said nothing. The silence stretched. Vance's smirk faltered, just slightly. Then he grabbed Grizz's old army cap off the table, twirling it between his fingers. "Man, I bet you tell all sorts of badass stories to the folks around here, huh?" He chuckled. "Thing is, I don't buy it." Joe muttered, "Vance, maybe you oughta—" "Shut up, Joe," Vance snapped, eyes never leaving Grizz. Grizz still didn't move, didn't blink. Instead, he reached into his pocket. For the first time, the bikers tensed. Their hands drifted toward their belts, ready for a weapon, for a fight. But Grizz wasn't reaching for a gun. He pulled out an old flip phone. The bikers laughed again. "Oh shit," one of them cackled. "He's calling his grandkids." Vance leaned back, shaking his head. "What's that, Gramps? Gonna call the sheriff? 'Cause I got news for you. Cops out here don't move fast." Grizz flipped the phone open, dialed a number, put it to his ear. His voice was calm even. "It's Calloway. I need a favor." Then he snapped the phone shut and set it back on the table, and went back to drinking his coffee. The bikers stared. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. Joe froze. Vance's smirk twitched. "What the hell was that?" Grizz didn't answer. Then, outside, they heard it. The low, rumbling growl of engines. Not the bikers' engines. More. Many more. The first headlights appeared through the window, then another, then dozens. One by one, motorcycles and trucks rolled into the parking lot, cutting off the bikers' own rides. Vance turned toward the window, his posture shifting. His fingers twitched slightly. "The hell?" one of his men muttered. Then the doors of the trucks opened, and men stepped out. Big men. Old men. Men with scars, with worn jackets bearing military patches, with eyes that had seen real war. These weren't cops. They weren't just bikers. They were veterans. And they had come for Grizz. Holloway, a former Marine with a face like stone, led the way. His voice was calm, but final. "Which ones?" Grizz finally set his coffee cup down. He gestured lazily toward Vance and his men. "These boys thought they could play tough." Vance took half a step back, and for the first time that night, he stopped smiling. The air inside the diner shifted, thickening like the moment before a thunderstorm. The laughter had died in the throats of Vance's crew, their smirks fading into something sharper, something nervous. Outside, the deep growl of engines still echoed, a slow, deliberate sound that sent a clear message. They weren't alone anymore. Vance turned to look through the diner windows, his head snapping toward the rows of headlights lining the lot. His grip on Grizz's army cap had loosened, and his posture wasn't quite as cocky as before. The first figures stepped into the neon glow. Holloway, the broad-shouldered ex-Marine, with scarred knuckles and a stare that could cut through steel, walked in first. Behind him, more men followed, some in leather cuts, some in military-issued jackets, all moving with a kind of quiet, unshaken purpose. These weren't just bikers, these were soldiers, men who had spent their lives fighting real wars, not bar fights. Rachel stood frozen behind the counter, her breath caught in her chest as she watched the flood of hardened men move in, slow and deliberate, like a pack of wolves closing in on wounded prey. Vance's cocky demeanor cracked. He stepped back from Grizz's booth, his hand drifting toward his belt, where a knife was tucked under his jacket. He wasn't alone. His crew reacted on instinct, shifting, reaching, thinking they still had a shot. Holloway saw it. His voice was low, like distant thunder. "I wouldn't." Vance hesitated, his fingers still hovering over the knife. Holloway stepped forward, his boots heavy against the floor. "You pull that knife, and you won't have a hand left to hold it." The words weren't a threat, they were a promise. Grizz finally looked up from his coffee, his expression calm, unshaken. He had seen men like Vance before, wannabe tough guys who had never seen real fear, real pain. But they were about to. Joe muttered something under his breath behind the counter. His hands were shaking as he wiped a rag over the surface, like cleaning something that was already spotless was going to change what was happening. Rachel couldn't look away. She had heard stories about Grizz, whispers from old-timers who had known him before he settled down in this town. They spoke of missions gone unrecorded, places no one admitted being, bodies left in shadows that never made the news. But she had never really believed them, until now. Grizz stretched slightly, rolling his shoulders, before reaching out and calmly taking back his army cap from Vance's grip. He dusted it off, placed it back on the table, and then, finally, he spoke. "I gave you a chance, kid." His voice was even, but there was an edge to it now, like the edge of a blade just before it's drawn. "You should have walked away when you had the chance." Vance clenched his jaw, his pride fighting a war against his survival instincts. One of his men, a younger guy with a desperate look in his eyes, suddenly reached for something under his jacket. A knife. The wrong move. Before he could pull it free, Holloway moved. It was fast, brutal. One moment the kid was standing, the next, he was pinned against the counter, Holloway's forearm crushing against his throat. His feet barely touched the ground, his knife clattering uselessly to the floor. The diner was dead silent. Holloway leaned in, his voice a low growl. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." The kid choked, his face turning red, his hands clawing at Holloway's arm. Grizz sighed and pushed his coffee cup aside, finally standing. "Let him go." Holloway didn't move immediately. He held it, just long enough for the lesson to sink in. Then, with a shove, he released the kid, who crumpled to the floor, gasping, his hands clutching at his throat. Vance watched it all, his eyes darting between Grizz, Holloway, and the men behind them, all standing still, watching him, waiting. Vance had been in fights before, plenty of them. But this wasn't a fight. This was a checkmate. Grizz exhaled slowly, stepping forward until he was face to face with Vance. "I could let you walk out of here," he said, his voice even. "Let you get on your bikes, let you leave town, let you pretend this never happened." Vance swallowed, his throat bobbing. "But if I do that," Grizz continued, his voice quiet, more dangerous than any shout, You'll come back. Maybe not tonight, maybe not tomorrow, but men like you don't know when to quit. Vance's jaw tightened. You're going to apologize, Grizz said, cutting him off. To the girl behind the counter, to Joe, to every person in here who had to listen to your bullshit. And then you're going to leave. And if I ever see your face in this town again... He let the words linger. Vance couldn't breathe. Grizz leaned in slightly. You won't have a face left to show. The moment cracked something in Vance. His eyes darted toward his men, looking for backup, but none of them moved. They weren't going to fight this battle. Not now. Not after seeing the kind of men they had just picked a fight with. Slowly, stiffly, Vance licked his lips and turned toward the counter. He swallowed hard before muttering, "Sorry." Rachel didn't say a word. Joe snorted, shaking his head. Pathetic. Vance's fists clenched at his sides, but he didn't argue. Grizz nodded toward the door. Go! The bikers didn't hesitate. One by one, they turned and walked out, heads down, pride shattered. The last one hesitated, the kid who had pulled the knife, but Holloway's glare sent him running. Outside, the roar of their bikes came to life again. Then, one by one, they peeled out of the parking lot. And they didn't look back. Inside the diner, the silence was thick, the weight of what had just happened settling over the room like dust after a gunfight. Rachel exhaled sharply, her hand still gripping the counter. That was... She shook her head, searching for words. I don't even know what that was. Joe just chuckled, shaking his head as he wiped down the counter. That was Grizz. Grizz sat back down, adjusting his cap, then finally picked up his coffee again. He took a slow sip, smirked. That wasn't much of a fight, he murmured. Holloway grinned, shaking his head. It wasn't supposed to be. The men who had answered Grizz's call lingered for a while, ordering coffee, chatting quietly. And then, one by one, they left the way they came, calm, controlled, as if they had never been there at all. Rachel watched them go, still trying to process everything. She turned to Grizz. So, just like that? It's over? Grizz didn't answer right away. He watched the road outside, the taillights fading into the darkness. Then, after a long moment, he exhaled. Yeah, he said. It's over. The rumble of departing engines faded into the night, swallowed by the desert silence. The neon sign outside the diner flickered, buzzing faintly in the aftermath of what had just unfolded. Inside, the air was thick with the weight of something unfinished. Grizz sat with his coffee, his expression unreadable. The men who had answered his call, old war dogs, brothers in arms, ghosts from the battlefield, had begun filtering out, heading back to wherever they had come from. They didn't linger. They didn't need to. Their message had been delivered, but as the last of them climbed onto their bikes, Holloway hesitated. He stood by the door, arms crossed, his scarred face shadowed under the dull glow of the overhead lights. His eyes flicked toward Grizz, sharp and knowing. They'll be back, he said. It wasn't a question. Grizz didn't look up. He took another sip of coffee, the warmth spreading through his chest, but he barely tasted it. Yeah, he said finally. They will. Rachel, who had been standing behind the counter with her arms wrapped tightly around herself, let out a slow breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. She had watched everything, from the moment those bikers swaggered in to the moment they were driven out like scared animals. She still wasn't sure how to process it. Joe muttered something under his breath, shaking his head as he wiped down the counter like that would somehow clean the tension out of the room. Damn fools should have just walked away. Duke, the mechanic who had been sitting quietly until now, finally spoke. Thing is, they did walk away. His gaze flicked toward Grizz. But not because they wanted to. Grizz set his cup down. No, he agreed, because they had to. Duke exhaled sharply. That means they're coming back mad. Holloway nodded, and next time, they'll come for blood. The silence that followed was thick, heavy with unspoken truths. Rachel's voice was quiet. So what do we do? Grizz pushed back from the table, stretching slightly before standing up. His bones ached, the kind of ache that never really went away, not after years of war, not after everything he had done. He adjusted his jacket, rolling his shoulders, and when he spoke, his voice was calm, steady, absolute. We finish it before they get the chance. Outside, the desert wind howled, carrying with it the distant echo of something coming. And Grizz knew this wasn't over, not yet. The bikers didn't go far. Vance's hands gripped the handlebars too tight, his knuckles turning white as his bike roared down the highway. His men followed behind him, their engines angry, growling, cutting through the night like a war cry. But inside, Vance wasn't thinking about the ride. He was thinking about what had just happened. Grizz had played him, humiliated him. The way those men had shown up, the way they had surrounded them without even raising their voices, it burned in his gut. They hadn't needed to throw a punch, because they had already won. Vance gritted his teeth, the rage curling tight in his chest. His crew had barely spoken since they rode out of town. Even Brick, usually the one with something to say, was quiet. Vance knew what they were thinking. They were wondering if he was weak, and that was unacceptable. The black truck pulled up alongside him, its tinted windows rolling down just enough for a voice to carry through the wind. Brick's voice was calm, measured. "What's the plan?" Vance didn't hesitate. "We burn that place to the ground." A long silence followed, the kind that meant someone was considering the weight of their next words. Then Brick spoke again. "That's a mistake!" Vance snapped his head toward him. "The hell do you mean?" Brick didn't blink. "I mean, that's not some old man sitting in a diner. That's a soldier. And not just him, those men he called in. That wasn't a crew. That was a unit." Vance's grip tightened. "You scared?" Brick exhaled, slow. "I've been in a war before, Vance." His voice dropped lower, like he was speaking to a child who didn't understand what fire could do. "You haven't." Vance's jaw clenched. He could feel the challenge in Brick's words, but more than that, he could feel the truth. Brick wasn't scared. He was cautious, and that made it worse. Vance turned back to the road, his rage burning hotter. "Doesn't matter," he muttered. "We're not leaving it like this. We go back. We end it." Brick sighed, shaking his head. But he didn't argue, because he knew when a man like Vance had his pride cut down, there was only one way it could end: in blood. The town slept, but Grizz didn't. He sat on the porch of the old service station next to Duke's shop, the glow of a cigarette the only light against the darkness. Holloway sat on the steps nearby, arms crossed, watching the road with the same kind of quiet intensity. "You know they're coming back, right?" Holloway asked. Grizz smirked. "I'm counting on it." Holloway exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. "You never did know when to back down." Grizz took another drag, let the smoke curl in the air. "You don't back down when you know you're right." Holloway chuckled, but it wasn't really laughter. "And when do you ever know you're right?" Grizz flicked the cigarette onto the dirt, crushing it beneath his boot. He looked toward the empty road, the same road where he knew those bikers would be coming from, and his voice was quiet when he finally spoke. "When the enemy's too stupid to know when to quit." Holloway didn't argue, because he knew this wasn't over, not yet. And when those bikes came roaring back into town, they wouldn't find the same quiet diner waiting for them. They'd find a war. The town slept under a blanket of darkness, but Grizz and his men didn't. They waited. The old service station was quiet, its dusty lights casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. Holloway sat by the door, his rifle resting across his lap, his eyes locked onto the highway. Duke was inside, checking supplies, making sure they had what they needed in case things went south. Grizz sat on an overturned crate, rolling a toothpick between his teeth, watching the road with the patience of a man who had spent his life waiting for fights to come to him. "They'll hit fast," Holloway murmured. "They won't waste time talking this time." Grizz nodded. "Good. Means we don't have to listen to their bullshit." He had no doubt Vance was coming. The kid was too proud, too stupid to let things lie. Humiliation like that sat like poison in men like him. It festered, boiled over, turned into something dangerous. He'd be back. And when he came, he'd want to make a statement. But statements didn't win wars. Preparation did. Duke stepped outside, wiping his hands on a rag. "Got some surprises set up. If they come through the back roads, they won't make it far." Grizz gave him a nod. "Good work." Then, just as expected, they heard it. Distant at first, but growing louder. The roar of motorcycles, the low grumble of truck engines, the kind of sound that meant bad men were coming with worse intentions. Holloway stood, stretching out his shoulders. Showtime! Grizz let out a slow breath, his fingers curling into fists. Let's get to work. The first bike pulled into town like a scout, its headlights cutting through the night. The rider slowed, checking the surroundings, his head swiveling left and right like he knew something wasn't right. Then the rest came, roaring in behind him, 15, maybe 20 of them, all armed, all ready to burn the town down if they had to. The black truck rolled in last, idling like a caged animal, waiting for the right moment to be let loose. Vance sat in the passenger seat, his fingers drumming against the dashboard, his jaw clenched so tight it looked like he might snap his own teeth. He had spent the last 2 hours stoking his own rage, convincing himself that this wasn't just about payback, this was about respect. Grizz had taken that from him, and tonight he was taking it back. The bikes spread out, parking in a loose formation, their riders stepping off slowly, scanning the street. The town was too quiet. Snake stepped up beside Vance, squinting into the dark. Something don't feel right. Vance ignored him, his gaze locked onto the diner. It was dark inside, closed for the night. Good, less witnesses. Then he turned toward the old service station. And there he was, standing in the dim light, his stance relaxed, his hands in his pockets, like he had been expecting them. John Grizz Calloway. Vance let out a slow exhale, forcing a smirk onto his face. He wanted this to feel like he was still in control. "Thought you'd skip town, old man," he called out, stepping forward. Grizz didn't move. "Thought you'd learn your lesson, kid." Vance's smirk twitched. "Yeah, well, I'm a slow learner." Behind him, his men tensed, shifting, waiting. But Grizz just tilted his head slightly. "No," he said, "you're just stupid." Then the lights cut on. Bright, blinding floodlights flooded the street from multiple angles. Shadows stretched long, the motorcycles, the truck, the men. Everything was exposed, and then the first gunshot rang out. Not a bullet, a warning. It cracked through the night like a firecracker, and the entire group of bikers flinched on instinct, hands reaching for weapons. Then came the voices, low, calm, commanding. "Drop your weapons." It didn't come from Grizz. It came from everywhere, from the rooftops, from the alleys, from the darkness itself. The bikers looked around frantically, realizing for the first time that they weren't alone. Holloway stepped forward from the shadows, his rifle slung over his shoulder, his expression unreadable. Duke emerged next, flanking the group from the side, a shotgun resting easily in his hands. Then more men stepped forward, not just bikers, but soldiers, real soldiers, veterans who had come at Grizz's call. Their stances were too disciplined, their presence too solid. The bikers had been expecting a bar fight. What they had walked into was an ambush. Vance's smirk vanished. His chest rose and fell sharply as he realized how badly he had screwed up. Snake swallowed hard, whispering, "Boss!" But Vance couldn't move. Grizz finally stepped forward, closing the distance between them. His voice was quiet, but it carried like a death sentence. "This is how it's gonna go." He let the silence stretch, watching them squirm, watching the moment sink in. "You and your boys are going to get on your bikes. You're going to get in that truck, and you're going to drive away. You're never coming back." Vance swallowed, his throat dry. "And if we don't?" he rasped. Grizz stepped even closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Then I bury you right here." The weight of those words crushed the air from the room. Vance saw it in his eyes. He wasn't bluffing. This wasn't some threat from a barroom tough guy trying to sound scary. This was real. Vance's fingers twitched at his sides. His hands had been ready to fight all night. But now he understood. This wasn't a fight. This was an execution waiting to happen. He took a shaky breath. "All right," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Grizz tilted his head. Louder. Vance gritted his teeth. His face burned with humiliation, rage, failure. "We're leaving," he forced out. His men didn't argue. They scrambled for their bikes, climbed into the truck, moving as fast as their bodies would let them. One by one, their engines roared to life. Then, with no more words, they peeled out of town. And this time, they didn't look back. Grizz watched them go, his expression unreadable. Holloway finally exhaled, shaking his head. "You always did know how to set the table." Grizz gave him a slow smirk. It's all about making sure your guests leave full. Rachel peeked her head out from the diner. So, is it over? Grizz stared at the road, where the last of the taillights disappeared into the desert. Then he finally nodded. Yeah, he said, it's over. And for the first time in a long time, he believed it. The dust from the departing motorcycles still hung in the air, curling in slow, lazy tendrils under the streetlights. The town was silent again. The tension that had choked the air just moments before had lifted, but something lingered, the weight of a finality that no one dared to speak aloud yet. Grizz stood at the edge of the pavement, his weathered hands in his jacket pockets, staring down the empty road. The last of the taillights had disappeared over the ridge, swallowed by the desert night, leaving only the distant echo of their engines, growing fainter with each passing second. Rachel stepped out from behind the diner door, hesitating just long enough to make sure it was safe. Her arms were crossed tightly over her chest, and though she tried to steady her voice, it still wavered slightly. They're not coming back, are they? Grizz didn't answer right away. He let the silence stretch, let the moment settle into his bones. He knew what she was really asking. Vance wasn't coming back. Not tonight, maybe not ever. But men like him didn't forget. They didn't learn from a lesson like this. They just learned to hate the ones who taught it. Holloway walked up beside him, arms crossed, watching the road like he expected to see headlights crest the horizon again. He let out a slow breath, one of those deep, knowing exhales that only men who had spent too much time in combat knew how to do. They're scared, he said, nodding toward the road. They know they lost? Grizz let out a quiet grunt. For now. Duke leaned against the hood of a nearby truck, wiping the sweat off his brow with the back of his hand. You think they'll be dumb enough to try again? Grizz finally turned, his eyes sweeping over the group of men still standing in the lot. The ones who had shown up for him, who had answered the call without hesitation. His old unit, his brothers, the ones who knew what it meant when a man like him made a call like that. No, he said finally. They won't. Rachel let out a breath of relief, her shoulders relaxing. Good, she muttered, because I don't think I could take another night like this one. Joe grumbled as he pushed through the door, looking around at the mess left in the aftermath. You and me both, kid. He wiped his hands on his apron, shaking his head. Next time you decide to start a damn war in my diner, Grizz, at least buy a round of drinks first. Grizz smirked, tilting his head slightly. I'll put it on your tab. Joe scoffed, muttering under his breath as he started sweeping up the broken glass near the door. The men in the lot began to disperse, some climbing onto their bikes, others lingering a little longer, exchanging nods and words that didn't need to be said out loud. This was how it always went. Fights like this, battles fought in quiet towns over bruised pride and bad decisions, they didn't always end in gunfire. Sometimes, the best victory was the one where no one had to pull the trigger. Holloway clapped a hand on Grizz's shoulder, his grip firm, steady. You ever need us again, you know what to do. Grizz nodded. Same goes for you. One by one, they mounted their bikes, engines growling to life. The sound wasn't menacing like it had been when Vance's crew rolled in. This was different. This was solidarity, a reminder that some men still stood for something, even in a world that didn't always respect it. Duke lingered for a moment longer, squinting at Grizz. You sure you're good? Grizz chuckled, shaking his head. I'm too old for good, Duke, but I'm standing. Duke grinned. That's about all we can ask for these days. The men rode off into the night, their presence lingering even after the last engine faded into the distance. The town was quiet again. Rachel finally let out a breath and leaned against the counter. I still don't understand, she admitted, shaking her head. How do you guys just walk away from something like this? Like it's nothing? Grizz didn't answer right away. He picked up his coffee, now lukewarm, barely drinkable, and took a sip anyway. Then he looked at her, his expression unreadable, steady as ever. Because we already fought the real wars, he said simply. This was just a reminder. Rachel studied him for a long moment, like she was trying to figure out what kind of life a man had to live to say something like that so casually. Joe shook his head as he locked up the door behind him. Well, I'll tell you what, Grizz. If you ever decide to retire for real, maybe give us all a damn heads up first. Grizz chuckled, setting his cup down on the counter. I keep trying, Joe. he said, pushing the cap back onto his head. Trouble just has a way of finding me. Rachel smirked. Yeah, well, maybe next time you'll let it find someone else. Grizz just smiled, tipping his hat as he turned toward the door. We'll see. As he stepped outside, the night air was cool against his face, the scent of desert sage and gasoline lingering. He stood for a moment, looking down the road where the bikers had disappeared. Maybe Rachel was right. Maybe he should have walked away. But men like him, they weren't built for walking away. They were built for standing their ground. And when the next storm came, because there was always a next storm, he'd be ready. Because men like him didn't fight for the fight itself. They fought so the people who couldn't wouldn't have to. And tonight that was enough. The end.